At this moment 3 years ago, where were you? And where did you spend most of your day? For the fair majority of you, I'm guessing your answer was home. 3 years ago, we were home all the time. As students, we faced the monotony of distance learning, of waking up every morning to Zoom meetings and seeing each other in tiny rectangles for a full school year and a half. For some of us, this was our first introduction to high school, and for others, we went from elementary school to high school in the blink of an eye. But a couple years have passed, and we've moved on. At least, our extracurriculars, academics, and environment have. But what about us? The truth is, for the fair majority of us, we've been more severely impacted by the pandemic than we realize. Think back to how you, as a person, were before the pandemic started. What were your academics and extracurriculars like? And how often did you hang out with your friends? What about now? I myself saw a stark change in my motivation levels during the pandemic. From my motivation to wake up in the morning and change clothes, to actually log into classes and do schoolwork. Over 800 other Fremont students have also weighed in on this topic, talking about their motivation levels and how they've changed from the 2020 to 2021 school years during the pandemic and distance learning to the 2021 to 2020 school year, back to in-person learning. And based on the changes in student motivation, it's clear that the pandemic has altered the way we fundamentally interact with the environment around us. The first example of this can be seen in students' disability to reach out to teachers for help during the pandemic. Of those surveyed during the 2020 to 2021 school year, roughly 84% of respondents reported a lower motivation to reach out to teachers for help than before the pandemic. Some teachers suggest that this could be for a couple of reasons. The first could be because students missed key developmental years during the pandemic. For example, those who went to distance learning in 8th grade or 9th grade lost key years to developing their socio-emotional and communicational skills. Students who lacked these skills during the pandemic were unable to employ this and later fell behind in their ability to deal with cognitively and socially challenging situations. Another reason teachers suggest that students might have a low willingness to reach out to them for help might be because many students had existing social anxiety, which was exacerbated during the pandemic, where students weren't placed in socially uncomfortable situations. Because they weren't placed in socially uncomfortable situations, students never had to learn how to interact and deal with them. But now, as we return from the pandemic, the demand for communicational skills has grown larger and larger, and these students have fallen further and further behind. The second impact of the pandemic that we can see in today's youth is a lower motivation during the pandemic to do schoolwork itself. Of those surveyed during the pandemic, roughly 54% of respondents reported a lower motivation to do schoolwork. Although this might seem obvious, this statistic proves two things. First, students have a lower intrinsic motivation now. Intrinsic motivation can be thought of as a motivation to do something because of an internal desire. For example, hanging out with your friends is generally intrinsically driven because it's something you enjoy. However, extrinsic motivation can be thought of as doing something because of an external reward or punishment. An example of this might be studying really hard for a test, where your studying and intense study hours are motivated by the external reward of doing well on the exam and performing well in the class. And these two types of motivation were also fundamentally impacted during the pandemic. We can see this in the homework statistic, where intrinsic motivation values were lower, where students had a lower motivation to pursue knowledge and to actually engage in class by their own internal volition. But extrinsic motivations were also tremendously lower, where students had a much lower motivation to do schoolwork or perform in class, despite having the extrinsic motivation of doing well in class. The motivation of doing well in class or of getting a good grade wasn't enough to motivate them to actually do the work itself. But this is all data from a couple years ago. What about now? Well, here's what the data from about a year ago says. Based on this data, we can see a tremendously higher motivation in students to spend time with their friends, but a tremendously lower motivation to reach out to teachers for help post-pandemic. This is an indication of both higher intrinsic motivation, but lower extrinsic motivation. We can see that intrinsic motivation levels post-pandemic are at an all-time high, where the motivation to reach out to friends and spend time with them once again is intrinsically motivated and is demonstrably higher post-pandemic. However, as we can see, the motivation to reach out to teachers for help is demonstrably lower than the motivation to hang out with friends, which is an indication of lower extrinsic motivation. Once again, the motivation to reach out to teachers for help in hopes of doing better in a class or performing well on a test isn't enough to outweigh the social costs of reaching out to teachers for help. But why is any of this important? Well, having lower intrinsic and extrinsic motivation levels, and also having the ability to interact with one another, of reaching out to each other and connecting with one another is essential to the human experience. It's not only essential right now as we're students, but as we grow older, the ability to form bonds with one another, to connect with one another, will fuel the rest of our lives. And we can see that the pandemic has fundamentally altered the way we interact with each other. So what can we do about this? Well, on a school level, there are a couple things we can do. First, in terms of students and student organization, we can have more events where students engage with one another. An example of this would be having more Spirit Weeks or ASG type events where students engage with one another by their own volition. But we can also have interaction and communication built into school curriculum itself. Instead of having classes that are fully centered around lectures, we can prioritize engagement-based learning, where students are recommended to interact with one another, with group projects, and also interact with their teachers, which will allow them to form deeper connections with not only one another, but with their peers as well. The pandemic has fundamentally altered the way we interact with the world around us, from our peers to our teachers, from how we understand ourselves. And the only way we can remedy these costs is to form deeper connections with one another. The only way we can do this is by putting ourselves in socially uncomfortable situations where we form these connections. And therefore, it is essential that we once again reconnect with each other post-pandemic.